Hello, this is Dr. Martin again. This week we're starting lectures on Chapter 19, Plants, and then Chapter 21, Animals. Then we'll do another lecture on some chemistry in a third lecture. It's kind of a lecture-heavy week this week. This is week 4 of the semester. So after this week, we're a fourth of the way done already in this semester. So let's just remember, just a bit of a recap. We're studying the three main domains of all life. Remember, the first one was bacteria, and then the second one was archaea, and now we're in the eukarya. The eukarya are the more complex cellular structures that comprise higher organisms, what we call higher organisms. We've already talked about the first group here, the protists, the one-celled eukaryotes. We talked about all of those. Now we're moving into chapter 19, plants, and then chapter 21, animals. So let's jump right in here with the plants. And you're familiar with these. I love plants. I love plants in Oklahoma. I love native plants in Oklahoma. One of my favorite classes to teach is field botany, where we study plants in the field. And so I'm sorry if I get a little more excited about plants than the typical person. So plants, remember, we have different kingdoms inside each of these domains. We had the protista, and now we have the plantae, what we call plantae. This is the plant kingdom, and then we'll do the animal kingdom in chapter 21. So you know the primary usefulness of the utilitarian need for plants is the production of oxygen. Now, we talked about algae producing much of the atmospheric oxygen, but plants, no doubt, very important, not just for oxygen cycles, but carbon cycles and carbon footprint cycles. And so I don't think we have to really talk too much about the use for plants, not just the utilitarian use for lumber and structure, but the pharmaceutical use of plants for pharmaceutical needs is tremendous. And so we simply can't live without plants. And so I don't think I have to harp on that too much. So here we go again, domain our eukarya. We had the kingdom protista, and we're going to do the kingdom plants, plantae now, and then animals next. Plants are divided into 4 groups. You're familiar with all 4 of these groups. We just make sure that you understand the 4 types, and we'll structurally talk about each one and how they differ. There are the non-vascular plants. By vascular, we don't mean they have blood vessels, but they do have vessels inside of stems and leaves that transport materials. We call that vascular tissue. You have vascular tissue as an animal. Plants have vascular tissues as plants, but there are the very primitive non-vascular plants. Then we have seedless vascular plants, meaning they have transport structures inside of them, but no seeds. Then we have the gymnosperms and angiosperms. Those are the ones that are much more complex and you are much more familiar with. Let's talk about some of the structures of plants. There's leaves. That's a pretty obvious one. Leaves collect sunlight. They have special adaptations to absorb certain wavelengths of light, green wavelengths of light, and use that for energy to produce their own carbohydrates. You eat your carbohydrates, plants make their carbohydrates. And most of this occurs in the leaves. They have stomata, which open and close, allowing gases in and out. Plants have to get rid of CO2 just like you do. You breathe yours out. Plants lose theirs through stomata. You breathe your oxygen in, and plants bring in their gaseous exchange through leaves. Vascular tissue we've already talked about. Notice the little square box down on the bottom right there. That's the vascular tissue. Remember this from high school biology? They have xylem and phloem. You have arteries and veins. Plants have xylem and phloem. They don't transport blood, but they transport gases, foods, carbohydrates, water. They transport just like your vessels transport, but we call this is the vascular tissue of plants. So we had leaves, then vascular tissue. Plants have roots, This is where they don't just draw water, but they draw nutrients as well. They need the same nutrients to live that you need to live, and they have to absorb all of those minerals and matter through the soil, through roots. And then we have pollen. If you have allergies, you're familiar with pollen. Pollen is reproductive structures that are produced especially by the male gametophyte or by the male structures of plants. It's analogous to sperm in humans. I don't try to humanize everything, but just to give you a bit of an analogy, pollen is the male structure, reproductive structures produced by plants. And then oftentimes pollen, when fertilized, will produce seeds. And these seeds can be pretty primitive or complex, depending, and we classify plants depending on their seed types. If these seeds are very viable for a long period of time, they can be preserved environmentally for a long period of time, years and years and years, before they actually wait for environmental conditions to improve so that they can grow. Flowers, not all plants have flowers. Not all plants need flowers. Some plants have showy petals, pretty petals. I think you can realize this, that those are used to attract pollinators. But not all plants are pollinated by insects. So if they are not pollinated by insects, they don't need bright, showy petals. Grasses, for instance, they're not pollinated necessarily by insects. They're pollinated by wind normally. So there's no reason to have showy petals. So flowers, sometimes we get a misconception of what a flower is. It's not the showy part. A flower is any part of the plant that has male or female reproductive parts. It might be showy, like in a pretty flower, or it might be dull, like in a plant, in a grass. But those are flowers. Those are the reproductive structures. So let's walk through the different types of plants, just starting with the most basic, work our way up to the most complex. We'll do the same thing with animals. So let's start with the bryophytes. Now, you've probably never heard the term bryophyte before, but these are very primitive plants. You have seen them. They're moss. And the mosses, hornworts and liverworts too, and bryophytes are all bryophytes. But the mosses are the ones that you are the most familiar with. You see them in the forest, see them in moist areas, shaded areas. They're not lichens. Lichens grow on rocks and a little more of a pale green color, but these are mosses, very primitive. They are non-vascular plants. They don't have xylem and phloem. They don't have vascular tissue inside their stems. They don't have seeds. Very primitive. Mosses are pretty primitive. Notice they're at the bottom of this evolutionary scale here. We will work our way up this scale to the most complex, but they don't have any tissues. They don't have roots. They don't have leaves. Don't have seeds. Don't have flowers. Think mosses. Pretty low growing, pretty primitive, pretty small, very compact plants. They move things and materials from cell to cell by water, by diffusion, by osmosis. They tend to be in shady soils, moist soils. They lack tall stem-like structures. So over on the far right here, you see the mosses, and you see the sporophytes here, the reproductive structures here on the mosses. Hey, they're pretty, they're soft, and you can see them out in the woods, especially in moist areas of woods. But they do produce a sporophyte on the end of a stalk, and you can see them usually in the springtime. You can see those sporophytes as you're walking out through the woods. You can sound really impressive by pointing out sporophytes to your companions. But these are the reproductive structures. They can reproduce sexually. They can reproduce asexually. Remember the difference? Sexual reproduction involves the use of sexual structures like gametes, male-female gametes, like sperm and egg. Bryophytes have sperm, and they swim to eggs that are produced in spores. But that's sexual reproduction, but they can reproduce asexually as well. Let's move on to the next group of plants. And again, moving up in complexity. These are the seedless, but they are vascular plants. They don't have seeds. They don't produce seeds like we normally think of. You're pretty familiar with most of these. Look in the far right over here. There we go. There's the ferns. This is the group that the ferns. And if you have in Oklahoma, I love growing ferns. At my house, I had big, huge queen ferns, Boston ferns, Christmas ferns, maidenhair ferns. I love ferns. And but you know this, if you look on the underneath side of ferns later in the summer, you see that brown rusty stuff on the underneath side. That's the spores. They produce spores. They don't produce seeds. They produce spores. They'll have some leaves. And now ferns, we call the leaves fronds. Those are fern leaves we call fronds. They have stems. They have roots. But they also are pretty relegated to pretty moist environments. You know this: shady environments, moist environments. You grow your ferns out on the front porch underneath an eave, or somewhere in the shade is where we grow our ferns. Beautiful plants though, but there's some other ferns here, or other seedless vascular plants here. But these are the ferns. Horsetails. You've probably seen horsetails and you just don't really recognize it. There's several places in Rogers County, Tulsa County, in eastern Oklahoma where horsetails will grow. Usually in moist areas. Again, they like to get their feet wet, but they live in rather moist areas. But the ferns are the most dominant plants here that you're going to be familiar with. Look in this upper right-hand corner here. There's those spores I was talking about, kind of a rusty brown looking. And here's the frond that we're talking about here, the fern leaf. They do produce zygotes, and they do reproduce sexually. They have an egg cell buried deep in the frond here, and then the sperm cell. They do have to usually require water to migrate towards each other for fertilization to occur. But yes, they do produce sexually. Let's continue to move up a little bit more complex here. Here's the gymnosperms. You're very familiar with the gymnosperms. Very old, ancient group. Tallest trees in the world. The redwoods, the sequoias, they are gymnosperms. Our spruces, our ferns, our pines, all of these are gymnosperms. You're very familiar with these. But they're not flowering plants. They have seeds. They have vascular tissue. They have seeds, but they're not as complex as some other plants we're going to look at here in a minute. The seeds are not enclosed in a fruit, like the seed of a peach or seeds of an apple. That's not gymnosperms. Gymnosperms are much more naked, a little smaller usually, but these are the gymnosperms. We call them naked seeds. Here's the four groups of gymnosperms. I skipped quickly to the ginkgo. Ginkgo is not a tree native to North America. I've been in Korea before, and the ginkgos are everywhere. They use ginkgo trees like we use Bradford pears in Oklahoma. They use them to line the sidewalks of their parks and their streets. But the ginkgo is a beautiful tree, but it is a gymnosperm. Most of the gymnosperms that you are familiar with are what we call the conifers. These are the cone-bearing gymnosperms that I've mentioned already. But these are the two main groups that you are familiar with. The leaves are kind of needle-like. They do produce egg cells. They do produce pollen, but they produce them in cones. The sporophytes, or the reproductive structures, they have female cones. They have male cones. The male cones sometimes are very prominent in the spring, and the female cones tend to mature later in the summer, and then they fall in the form of what we call a pine cone. But that's where the reproductive structures are at. They're very woody, very strong trees, very fast growing trees. Here you see the fertilization occurs, and then it usually gets embedded in a small cone, which falls to the ground, and then that's where the egg and the sperm are fertilized in a cone. They don't require water like the two groups we talked about before, the mosses and the ferns. Gymnosperms can occur in very dry in environments. Sometimes we think of ferns in the southeastern part of the United States, but the western part of the United States and the deserts, ferns are pretty common. Ponderosa pines, all of these are many of them in the western United States. Uh, Angiosperms. This is the highest group of the plants. These are the flowering plants. None of the plant groups that we talked about, the mosses, the ferns, the gymnosperms, they don't have flowers. But here, these are the flowering plants. These are the angiosperms, very large group. 95% of all plant species fall into this group. And so it's a very large group, not quite as old as the gymnosperms, but uh, very prolific growers and widespread diversity. They produce pollen, the male structure. They have eggs, usually at the base of the flower. Um, Remember, when we're talking about a flower, we're not talking about the showy petal part. Now those are just petals. That's just a part of the flower. Normally, the ovary is at the base of a flower and has to be pollinated. Pollen grains from the male structures have to, obviously, if we're going to reproduce sexually, the pollen grains from the male structures have to interact with the female ovaries of the flower. And sometimes they need pollinators, insects, birds, bats, sometimes wind. They need some other structure to get the pollen to the ovary in the flower. But these are the angiosperms, and usually the petals, that the showy petals that we see, are just attractors. They're just attractors for the pollinator. Um, and insects have all usually evolved to pollinate certain kinds of plants, hummingbirds, bats, whatever. But the petals are just used as an attractor, and the ovary is usually at the base of the flower. Here it is, right here. Here's the ovary, so the egg is here, and this is where the sperm lands, up here at a very sticky part. And then look, here's the male structures here, the anthers. Here's the stigma. Now we can have self-pollination. Oftentimes it occurs in plants, but it's much more beneficial from a diversity standpoint if they are cross-pollinated with other plants of the same species. But here's where the fertilization occurs, right here in the ovary. And then oftentimes a fruit will develop right here, a very showy fruit. And that's where we get our fruits. I'm not trying to sound gross, but when you're eating a peach or an apple or a plum, or you're eating the ovary with the seed inside, the pollinated seed inside. Um, but these are the angiosperms. So the embryo develops inside and usually produces a fruit of some type. All kinds of diversity of fruits here. When they germinate on the ground or germinate in soil, sometimes that germination has to be passed through the digestive tract of an animal. Oftentimes that's how seeds get dispersed. Sometimes these seeds get dispersed by attaching to your plant, to the hair of an animal, or to the pant leg of your pants, like cockleburs or stick tights or goat heads, things like that. Sometimes they have to be transported in order for germination to occur. And we can sit here all day and name all kinds of types of germination or pollination. It could be, you've done this. Look at the maple plant here. Remember the helicopters as a kid when you throw those helicopter seeds up in the air, what we call samaras, and they would float to the ground. And that's how maples and ashes will transport their seeds. Cattails, you've seen that. Where they'll split open and bust open, and wind will pollinate or distribute their seeds. Here's the showy petals of a plant being pollinated by an insect, and just all different types of diversity of fruits and pollination techniques, and very complex group of plants here. So hey, that's it. That I know that's a 10,000 foot view of plants. But hey, this is not botany. We require botany for our biology majors, but it's not required for you. But that's about as good of a 10,000 foot level view of plants. We'll move on to animals in chapter 21.